Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this tutorial, I want to share some tips for palette blending with water-based markers. This is a great way to soften your marker coloring into a more painterly watercolored look. It's more forgiving on certain papers that may tend to stain with watercolor markers and leave a dark blotch. And it's a technique that can be used with a variety of dye-based and water-soluble media. It's just a really fun technique to play with.
It's also a great way to stretch your marker colors if you only have a few to work with.
For the tutorial, I'm going to be working with these Zig Clean Color markers, but this is something you can do with other water-based markers and with dye ink pads and re-inkers as well. One thing I like about these markers is that they have a real brush tip rather than the typical felt tip of other markers. You'll begin by creating a palette with the marker inks, and I'm just going to make mine by scribbling a little area onto this sheet of plastic with each color that I'm going to use for my project. Your palette can be anything non-porous, so it could be a CD case, a ceramic tile, a styrofoam plate, maybe a piece of glass or a piece of acrylic or an acrylic block. Anything that you can find that's non-porous will work for this. One way to use these markers is to color directly to the paper and then blend it out with water. With some papers, it's difficult to blend the color out completely, and you'll end up with a stain where the marker first touched the paper. So the palette blending is a way to avoid getting blotches when you paint. It's a little bit more forgiving and it creates a smoother blend. With the ink on the palette, you can control the intensity of the color on the paper. You can add water to dilute the ink for a lighter color, and I usually pull the diluted color away a little bit on the palette so it doesn't contaminate the original scribble that I made. The water helps it spread further on the paper too, so this is great for the first layers of color when you paint.
If you remove water from the brush and grab ink from a more concentrated area on the palette where the water hasn't mixed into the original color, you'll get a darker shade of the color. So be sure to practice blending with water to be able to control how much ink and how much water to use. While the color is still wet on the paper, you can also add in a darker color with your brush for shading and allow the water to blend and move the colors around and together. I'll talk about blending methods in a minute. I wanted to mention that some dye inks will separate with the addition of water. If you're working with distress inks, they are formulated to not separate, but some inks will. There's just some science happening there. Here's an example of how this black ink separates out over time, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're expecting it and you want that separation to happen. It's just a good thing to know about the medium that you're working with. If you want to test the inks that you have, coffee filters work really great for testing chromatography, just like I did here. There are a few different techniques for blending, so I'll show you those first, and then I'll use one of those techniques to color a full sample. In this first method, I'm taking each area one at a time and doing all my layers of color in a wet into wet technique. So I'll start with a diluted color by adding water to the color on my palette, and I'll cover the whole area. Then I'll take some more concentrated color and just add it in with the tip of my brush where this area would have shading. So these areas toward the bottom of the flower and the ones that are curving away. And that second layer of color will blend into the first layer as it continues to dry. As the area dries more, the color I add in will stay darker and blend out less. With this second method, I work in layers and I let each layer dry in between. And this is how I tend to do my watercolor paintings. This layering method is called glazing, and rather than a continuous blend like the first sample, it allows the first layers of color to kind of show through later layers, and it gives a little different sense of depth to each area. If you work this way and you're coloring several areas at a time, just be sure that they're not touching each other or the colors will bleed together. So I started here with a diluted layer of color covering the whole area, and I'll let that dry. And then I'll come back in and shade with a slightly darker color and dry that. And then just continue to add layers until I have the look that I want. Since I'm just picking up color with the tip of my brush, I can use the water that's being held inside the brush to blend out the color with this side of the brush. With the next method, I want to show you how you can create colors that don't exist in your marker or ink collection. Usually we like to blend with light, medium, and dark, but you can create an intermediate color by blending two colors together on your palette. So I'm starting here with this bright pink and putting down a good layer of color. Then I'll blend a little pink with a little purple and create a color that's a combination of the two, and that will be my medium color. Then I'll do the final shading with the purple. This is a great way to stretch your marker collection, especially if you're just starting out and only have a few basic colors. I have a couple more blending techniques for you. This one is not a watercolor technique, but it is a palette blending technique for watercolor markers. You can use the tip of the marker to pick up color from your palette and then blend it out from side to side until you get back to the original marker color. And this last one is not a palette blending technique, but the look is kind of similar, so we'll just call it a watercolor technique. You can dip the tip of your marker into water and blend that back out to the original color. These markers are designed to push color out, so neither of these techniques will hurt your markers, and they're great techniques for smooth blending. I'm going to go ahead and speed through coloring a full image so you can see a couple of these techniques in action. This is a digital image from Power Poppy. It's called Tulips in a Hobnail Pitcher. Such a pretty one. I'm just starting off with diluted color and filling in a base coat on these tulips. And you'll notice that I'm choosing areas that aren't touching, so the colors will stay in place and not bleed together. You'll also notice that I've chosen colors that go well together, so I can use a darker color like the orange to shade over itself or to shade over the yellow. You can really get a lot of variety out of just a few colors as you vary the amount of water and blend and layer the colors together. You can even create new colors on your palette. As some of the layers dry, I'm going in with a darker color to add shading and more detail. And remember that your shaded areas will usually be toward the bottom of an image, along where images overlap, like behind a petal or behind a leaf here, and where objects are curving away from you. And a couple of the flowers where the inside is showing, those will be darker too. Mainly here I'm working to build up layers of color, and that is what will give depth and dimension to my image. The first green that I laid down on my palette was too light, so I just went with the darker green here, and once I have that all in, I'll use blue to shade the darker areas. Remember, you can use opposite colors for shading too, so consult a color wheel if you're not sure what color to use. But I'm going to use the blue inside those orange flowers, and that'll work really well for shading inside a bright color. I want to ground the image so it doesn't look like it's floating in the middle of the air. So I'm just going to mix up all the colors on my palette for a nice neutral that coordinates with the colors I've already used. That's another way to stretch your colors and make sure everything's matching on your piece. So here's that finished image on 2 cards. I printed it large so I could cut the panel in half and stretch it a little bit further. And the sentiments I used here are from Impression Obsession. I hope this gives you some inspiration to try some new techniques, and I hope you'll share what you create. Thank you so much for watching.